will be able to access it. However, if you have any objections to that, do let us know in the chat box. And there's a suggestion we do a group picture. So also we'll take some snapshots and make sure we create a group, kind of a virtual group picture, and send it to everybody. But if you have any objection to that, do let us know and we'll carve that out. So with that, I'm going to move on pretty quickly and explain a little bit about what is this leadership and humanity for those of you who are probably first time getting exposed to this. I'll start with myself. In my 30 years of career spanning across Asia, Europe, Middle East, Africa, and now in the US, I've been a student of leadership and observing the best of the leaders and had a chance to work with them. And it always fascinated me why some people step up and come across as inspirational, more effective leaders compared to others in a similar situation. They struggle and are not able to have the same level of impact. So in my quest to know more about this, I started connecting with some of the colleagues, and some of those are on the call today. And we kind of started unfolding leadership a little bit. And what stood out for me is that people who lead with their core, who lead with who they are able to have a more sustained impact on this world. Now, in the present situation with this pandemic, a whole new story has opened up. I mean, this is a kind of situation which has disrupted the way we have ever lived or ever worked. At the same time, it has opened up enormous amount of opportunities to reset. And I can tell you, I'm part of a global business, and as we are kind of resetting our strategy, spending tons of time and effort to basically go back to the drawing board and see what would it take to stay relevant and be successful. I think it's a time to reset the leadership in the same moment. The way people have led so far is not going to be sustainable. The whole kind of canvas of the world is changing. I mean, from geopolitical situation to policy decisions by the governments to business environment, consumer preferences, job scenes. I mean, there are industries where we have 60-70% of the roles impacted, leisure, hospitality, etc. And then you have industries, Amazon added 500,000 roles in 2020, almost doubling their workforce worldwide. So it's a complete reset which is happening. And I think leaders need to take a step back and reflect on what they need to do to make sure that they are not only inspiring themselves, they're inspiring everybody around them. And they are inspiring the change or the transformation which this world is going to go through. So today's dialogue is focused on having two accomplished global thought leaders to come and share their perspective on the way they see change and the way they see leadership unfolding and evolving in this new environment. So helping me in this dialogue in next 90 minutes, as I mentioned, are Bhavna Gandhi and Rajesh Shurkat. A little bit about Bhavna. Rajesh. Bhavna is leading human resources for the specialized nutrition business of Danone, covering broad geographies, including Americas, Asia, Middle East, Africa, CIS, and exports. She's based in Singapore and has been part of this journey for quite a while and has been leading this agenda in her own way in the space she operates in. Rajesh, again, I know Rajesh for a pretty long time. He's an inspirational leader based out of Hong Kong, supporting global supply chain for metal toys. So they will be leading these conversations with Henna and with Andreas. So with that, first I'm going to invite Bhavna to introduce Andreas, followed by Rajesh introducing Henna, and then starting the dialogue with both these leaders. As I said, feel free to pop up any questions anytime. Don't wait for that session in the dialogue box and we'll address those. So thanks again. And Bhavna, inviting you to take over.
Thank you, Atul. And thanks everyone for joining us today. It's wonderful to have this conversation. And I'm very excited to introduce Andreas Roberts, the founder of BioLeadership Project. He also co-founded Way of Nature. So I listened to Andreas' TED Talk and I was I really immediately connected with him. And I think his TED talk was quite famous. And the subject of the TED talk was how would nature change leadership? And the topic really resonated with me. Andres is a guide, facilitator, advisor dedicated to new kind of progress, fit for a positive future for all. And his work combines renewed ideas about leadership and change, reconnection to nature, and the wisdom of ancient cultures to help more positive and more systemic change to happen. Andres is on a mission to reinvent leadership to be more like nature. He argues rather than battling with the old operating system, making nature our guide might be the most important innovation of our time. Andreas works with institutions such as Patagonia, World Benchmarking Alliance, and Amani Institute. Welcome, Andreas, to join us here today. It's a pleasure to have you here in this dialogue, in this conversation. And our second guest today is Henna. I'll invite Rajesh to introduce Henna.
Thanks, Bhavna. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome again to the session. And thank you, Atul, for giving the opportunity to introduce Henna and also for part of the session. So it's my privilege to welcome and introduce Henna Inam, who is the CEO of Transformation Leadership Inc. and a former C-level executive with Novartis. She received her MBA from Wharton School at University of Pennsylvania, and I completed education, executive education from Harvard Business School. She has been part of multiple transformational journey, very inspirational. The work she did in P&G and Novartis, including her roles in Global Head of E-Innovation, Chief Marketing Innovation Officer. She led the region for Americas and also a country general manager in Mexico. She is a leadership blogger for Forbes. She has appeared on Fox Business, NPR, and has been quoted in Fortune, CNN, Money Online. She is also the organizer for TEDx Women Atlanta and a member of Board of Counselors for the Carter Center. And not to miss out, she had, she's the author of two recent bestsellers, Wired for Authenticity and Wired for Disruption, So Hannah had a chance to, go through your Wired for Authenticity book. It's really inspirational and really looking forward to hear from you. So again, thank you so much for taking out time for us. And I pass the forum to you. Over to you, Henna.
Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know we have people here from all kinds of time zones. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I had the opportunity to work with Atul. Gosh, Atul, I think it was 13, 14, how long ago? A long time ago, right? And I love the mission of this group. Atul was telling me that some group members have been together taking trips together in all kinds of really interesting and inspirational places. And I was definitely of the mind to, Atul, sign me up for one of those trips. I think we're all feeling like we're being locked down for way too long. I love the mission of this group. I loved, it was the first time that I had seen the diagram, Atul, where you showed how we operate from the core of who we are, and that really impacts overall our impact on others. It impacts our workplace, obviously our important relationships. And I wanted to share actually from my book, Wired for Authenticity, one of the quotes is, "Authentic leadership is the full expression of me for the benefit of we." And what authentic leadership is operating actually from the core of who we are. And that core is what I call the authentic self, is the intelligence at the core of who I am. It is the part of my being that is wise, calm, creative, and adaptive. And I think one of the things I want to share here with the group is my new passion, to which I want to dedicate the next few years of my life, is about presence, leadership presence. And it is actually that part of ourselves that is fully present here now, that is that sort of intelligence at the core of us. And, we've heard a lot about, technology advancing and artificial intelligence and how that is going to disrupt our world for the future. And one of the things that I'm really inspired to talk about is human intelligence, the human intelligence that's at the core of who we are, which is the core, I think, Atul, that you and the community here are talking about, and getting a much better sense of what is that? How do we really, how do we make that part of our language of leadership? Because I think a lot of times, if many of us have worked in large organizations, and the language of leadership that I know growing up, when I worked at Procter & Gamble, the language of leadership was set a vision, make sure that people are aligned to that vision, and then make sure that it's executed, right? That used to be the language of leadership. And then when I worked at Novartis, the language was around our leadership values, which were around collaboration, and it was around agility and all of these other things. But I don't think any of us really talked about who are we at our core, and how are we, what is our impact in this moment? Because one of the things that I'm really passionate about is creating a better world. And I'll share a little bit, Atul asked me to share a little bit of my story. So I don't think I knew what my core was until I turned 40. So I had a little bit of a midlife crisis when I turned 40. I had been at that point working almost 20 years in corporate America. Actually, I was working with Novartis at the time. And that year I was the GM for general manager for our business, Novartis's business in Mexico. And each year, the CEO of Novartis would pick 10 leaders out of a company of 90,000 to give an award to in terms of business building. So that year, my team and I were selected from a little country in Mexico. So it was obviously a huge honor. And I remember, being invited to Basel for our January, leaders meeting, and then coming back, being awarded, and then coming back and on this long plane ride at 35,000 feet in the air. Long plane rides have always been existential moments for me because there's nothing to do and you're there with your own thoughts. And so I remember thinking, I should really be happy. And I was happy. Of course, I was, proud of our accomplishment as a team, but I knew that there was something that was missing, that I wasn't happy. And that was the time when I feel like I really discovered that accomplishment and achievement is not the same thing as fulfillment. Because up to that point in my career, this was at the height of my, career in terms of my own accomplishments and the team's accomplishments. And if this wasn't making me happy, I wanted to figure out what it was that was going to make me happy. And so I went off to an ashram in India. And I think, Atul, you were with Novartis when I came back from my ashram trip. And I remember it was the longest vacation that I had ever taken in my life. I'd taken 20 days off. And I wanted to really connect with who am I? Why am I here? And ultimately, what is it that's going to fulfill me? Because there are all of these wonderful accomplishments and challenges, and they don't seem to be doing the job. And over the course, so my time at the ashram was absolutely beautiful. It was peaceful. I came back with a greater sense of connection to myself, really, and connection to others. I had told my team at the time, please don't email me because I will be, in this program. And I remember the one or two emails I would get, I would want to, respond to the email and then say, love Henna. And I thought, oh my God, they're going to think she's completely lost it. Why is she talking about love and business? But that's really how I felt. I felt so much love for myself, more connected to others. And I remember coming back from that, and I'll make the story short. And over the course of the next 2 or 3 years, when I really started my mindfulness practice and continued to practice, what I became aware of is my moment-to-moment experience. And that moment-to-moment experience is actually what caused me to understand what was going to be fulfilling. So I was no longer focused in my head around what is the agenda for the next meeting and how do I show up looking really good and smart. And I was much more focused on what's this experience. And it was really a whole body experience of this moment. And I remember sitting on a Saturday on the back staircase and talking to one of my employees who had been looking for another job, and she had been turned down. And she was, obviously grieving that. And sitting there and talking and listening to her over the course of an hour and a half. And I remember at the end of that conversation, how good I felt. I hadn't felt that good in a very long time. And it was because I was truly present to her and I was able to help her see what was happening with her and actually really coaching her through that experience. I had never, I had coached people, but I never recognized how beautiful that experience of actually coaching somebody and listening to them deeply and helping them feel empowered in who they are felt. And that was sort of an aha moment for me in the sense that, wow, this is fulfillment. Now I know what this feels like. And it didn't matter at the end of the day, how I had looked. It didn't, the ego was sort of set aside. And that to me was the kind of the power of fulfillment. Fast forward, several years later, I finally got the courage up to leave my corporate job. And I started my company. It's called Transformational Leadership. And the role of transformational leadership is really to help organizations create both authentic and agile, and frankly, more human leaders. And so that's where my work is. Recently, I also wrote a book called Wired for Disruption. And the whole notion of that book is we as human beings are actually wired to be agile. And when we can connect with that presence that's inside of us, that presence is actually much more agile. And so I talk about 5 forms of agility in that book, and I'm happy to share more about it. And but I'll kind of stop here. I know that we want to have people, I'm happy to have people direct the conversation in whatever direction that they want to go.
Thank you, Henna, for that wonderful, inspirational sharing of your story. We have some questions coming, so I will take them. Kanan, in case if you want to open up and ask your question, uh, otherwise I can ask for you. You can unmute yourself. Yes.
All right, thank you, everybody for this opportunity, and thank you, Henna. It was really interesting to hear you speak on some of the core subjects, core points that I always believed in. One of the dilemmas that I keep coming across very often is how does one balance between the intellect and the faith? When you talk about business, many times we are driven by business results, the numbers, chasing the numbers and producing the top line and bottom line. But sometimes I feel that we got to have faith in people. We got to have faith in ourselves. But you get pushed back into, all right about the faith, but we need the numbers on the table. So how does one balance, and what are your thoughts about balancing the two, and how do we take this forward?
Yeah, so Kanan, I think that's a really good question. It's one that I've struggled with myself a fair amount. And, I think our ego would have us believe that we have more control, or would like for us to have more control over the end outcome than we actually do, particularly in a really complex and disruptive environment. Right? When you're running a machine and the rules are clear, the machine is optimized, it's like, okay, we know how this works. But in a complex environment where there's a lot more unpredictability, there's a lot more noise in the system. Anytime you introduce people into a system, that in itself introduces complexity, right? Because things are not as clear, because people are not machines. And so if you come back to that question, to me, change, any kind of change, let's say that you're trying to reach a set of numbers, any kind of change only happens in the present moment. It's in this conversation with you, Kanan, that I'm able to influence you, and how present I am to you. What are some challenges that you're facing? What are some things that really motivate and energize you? If I'm really focused on you, then the results, I will have better insight into what's actually going on, and I'm able to better influence the results. And I know that there's this false dichotomy, like, can I do the numbers or can I do the people? Actually, you're going to do the numbers by focusing on the people. And so that's not, I have to say, this is not what I practiced in my corporate career most of the time, but it is certainly something that I am noticing, in my coaching with my executive clients. One of the things I'm noticing is how much the really honoring the person that's in front of you and really listening to them and understanding what's important to them is ultimately what enables the results.
Thank you.
Thanks, Henna. Janice has a question build up on what you just said. She's asking, what techniques do you use to stay in the moment? And it's really focus on the moment. It can be very difficult to do that. So any tips for us? How do you stay in the moment?
And by the way, Hemant and Janice, I think this is a similar question, and it'll be nice to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah. So yes, our mind is always jumping, right? They call it, in many circles, they call it the monkey mind. And it's always jumping. And particularly now with our devices and our dings, and our attention is always distracted. And I worry about our young leaders, who've grown up on this sort of constant attachment to their device, and their attention span is getting lower and lower. Because I think really the very most powerful thing that we have at our core is our attention, and where we choose what our intention is in terms of where we choose to focus our attention. Mindfulness training, I think that many of you are probably familiar with it. This is what I learned when I was at the ashram. It was my first time, actually. We would get up at 6 a.m. in the morning on an empty stomach, and it's very hard to meditate for an hour on an empty stomach, let me tell you. But that's what we would practice. And it was really a beautiful experience. And I think when we can learn how to truly stay in the moment, connected to ourselves, connected to whatever is present in the moment, and with an intention to serve the moment. So that intention to serve the moment isn't coming from our ego. It's not coming from the agenda that we have, which, by the way, comes from a very limited perspective, right? Our agenda is only our agenda because our perspective is limited. Now, when we are more open, particularly in complex and changing and disruptive environments, our only way to learn actually is by being present to the moment, and then learning how to figure out how to serve the moment. And so I think mindfulness practice, there's actually, if anybody's interested in mindfulness, there's lots of apps out there. And there's a course that I have on LinkedIn Learning on mindfulness practices at work, which has been seen by 500,000 people, taken by 500,000 people. And so I really, really encourage you to check that out, or any other mindfulness app.
Thanks, Henna. In fact, chance to go through that learning, it's really inspirational. I had a lot of takeaways from that. James and Noah has a similar question, so I just read it out. What they want to know from you is, how do you make the corporates accept or be receptive of your views on the original view of human leadership, and how do you overcome their potential resistance to that?
Wow, I think there is actually a shift that's happening. I was at the World Economic Forum in Davos this year. They had a virtual conference. It was called the Davos Agenda, which any of you that are interested, please, there's lots of virtual videos that are available for everybody to watch. But I do really think that there is a shift that's happening. There is incredible concern at the very highest levels of organizations. These are CEOs and CHROs who are focused on how do we create a more sustainable planet. So Larry Fink, who is the head of BlackRock, who obviously controls, largest money manager, controls trillions of dollars and impacts boards who impact people, right, and CEOs. He said he wants every single organization to create a plan that says, how are they going to become a much more sustainable and carbon neutral and serve the carbon neutral economy by 2050. Now, carbon neutral economy requires people who are more connected to our planet, because carbon neutral economy will not happen without the work of us human beings, right? And in order for us to make that work happen, and this is, by the way, is not trivial, right? This requires a huge change in our fundamental systems, the way that we evaluate CEOs, the way that we create a market for carbon, for nature-based carbon solutions, right? So there's a lot of collective action that's going to need to happen. And so I think that will require a fundamental evolution and shift in us as human beings to be more connected to each other, to be more connected to ourselves. And I'm sure your personal experiences, when you are in your moments of greatest peace, you actually do feel more connected to the people around you, to the planet, to nature.
Thanks, Henna. There are a lot of questions coming, so we'll try to take as many of them as possible, but that's really inspirational. So Derek wants to know, and I think this may be something very common to many of us, he's asking, how do you make the daily coaching conversations, don't look like therapy?
Yeah, so I don't know what you mean by therapy, because sometimes it is therapy. And what's wrong with that? There is a real place for our humanity in our workplaces. We have somehow made humans like machines, or in our heads, we've assumed that humans are machines, and we're going all after, efficiency and optimizing our time and productivity. It's like, we're not machines, we're human beings. And as human beings, we have emotions. And by the way, those emotions impact the people around us, they impact ourselves, they impact our productivity, and they also impact our engagement. They impact the experience of the workplace. And so if we're trying to somehow pretend that we're not working with humans, I think we're kind of starting at the wrong place. And sometimes my coaching sessions are actually helping people connect more deeply with themselves and what's really happening. And one of the tools I want to share with you, which is in my book, it's the Wired for Disruption book, is called the Mind Story Map. And a lot of my clients actually use that tool now. They've kind of learned how to very quickly get themselves into the Mind Story Map. And the tool, by the way, there's an agility quiz and whatnot that you can take on my site that'll help get you some of these tools. But the tool is all about, in this moment, how am I feeling? And being able to take a much more mindful perspective, because a lot of times, what is the problem that we're often get stuck in is just the perspective we're in. There's no problem to be solved. There is only the taking that step back and seeing that, I've got a very limited perspective on this situation. And maybe if I try to see what is possible outside of my story or my perspective, that is what's really important and will shift something.
Thanks, Henna. In fact, Afshin and Lian has a very similar question, and they want to know, your thoughts in the context of COVID. How, as an authentic leaders, we can create a sense of physical and psychological safety amongst our teams?
Yeah, the best tool starts, Rajesh, with yourself, right? So one of the 5 forms of agility, in fact, the one that's actually at the core in the book that I write about, is called neuro-emotional agility. And neuro-emotional agility is our ability to manage our own neurobiology. So under threatening situations, ambiguity, or disruption, what tends to happen is that our mind shifts and mind-body shifts into a state of anxiety and fear. And there's some fantastic research, by the way, if you happen to be a neuroscience geek like I am, I don't know I'm not a researcher, but I totally geek out on neuroscience. And there's a lot of research from a person by the name of Dr. Richard Boyatzis. And by the way, if you're into podcasts, please check out that podcast episode that I have with Richard Boyatzis. And he talks about how our mind operates in two different networks. There's an analytic, which is a task-focused network, and there is a empathic, which is a much more creative, curiosity-based network and connected network. And most of the time when we're at work, we're in the task phase, like where are the numbers? And, you know, how can I get to my goals? And what he says is the people, including ourselves, are most open to change and learning not when we're in our task-based network, but when we are in our empathic network. And so there's a lot of fantastic tips and tricks that he offers that are in the book and also in the podcast about how do we shift our own neural state. So the best way to create psychological safety is first to shift your own neural state, become aware of it. And that's where the mindfulness helps, right? Where am I now? What's my neural state, neuroemotional state, and how do I shift it so that in my conversation that I'm going to have with Rajesh, how do I make sure that I'm in a decent place, in a curious, creative, and connected place, so that then I can be more open to listening to what's happening with him? And that goes back to presence.
Right. In fact, Vikas has a way, has a question very linked to what we just said about individual agility, and he wants to know what's your advice on ways to switch on the agility at an individual level, especially through lockdowns. I think all of us have undergone the lockdowns, and as we move to work from home roles, and the human interactions reduces. So how do we really switch on to individual agility?
Yeah. So neuro-emotional agility is at the core, and it's our own ability to shift our own mind-body state. And there are a couple of ways to do that I will just share with you. One is, actually, let's just try a little practice for 30 seconds. I want everybody to close their eyes and just, put your hand here on your chest and maybe another hand on your belly. And just take a deep breath. You could close your eyes or you can leave them open, but just sometimes closing our eyes, I find for me actually helps me connect more deeply with myself. So just taking a deep breath in. And the reason I want your hand on your belly is because that's where you want to breathe from. So noticing your belly rise. And then noticing it fall. One more deep breath. These long exhales that I'm doing right now actually activate your parasympathetic nervous system, which is our rest and relax nervous system. And one more deep breath. And now if you want, you can just put in chat, just notice how you're feeling now and what taking 3 deep breaths has done for you. Just put it in chat if you'd like. But for me, that, we have something really free and totally available to us 24/7, which is our breath. And 3 deep breaths. And that can switch you. In the course on mindful practices for work, there are meditations or practices to invite more joy in our lives. And you can actually, it's a neural network that you can actually activate. And the more you practice, the more easy it becomes. And I love what somebody said, connected and alive. That's exactly how it feels. And when you are connected and alive and no longer in the mental chatter, all the stories that are in your head, but you're actually in your body, you're more available to listen. Because, when most of us are listening, really what we're doing is we're kind of waiting to speak. Let that person stop talking, so let me tell them what my point of view is, right? And so you're actually more available when you're actually in that connected and alive place. And it's a simple, and by the way, in that podcast interview which we can, I don't know if somebody can go to my website and share that. That would be really helpful. That little podcast interview with Richard Boyasis, he gives you 5 other tips that are really, that work based on neuroscience. Like they've done fMRI studies of the brain, right? And what I can say is the more you practice, the quicker you fall into this very deep and calm state.
Okay, Henna, I have one more question for you before we move to the next session. And this is something is my question I wanted to really know from you. You have got a very inspirational story, and as I was reading about you, what you've been on the mission, I read your mission to impact 1 million people. Could you talk more about it? And where are you on your journey? I'm sure that's very inspirational to many of us.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when we went into lockdown in March, for us in the US, it was in March last year, I really sat and thought about how can I be of service in this time period? And I thought, well, what do I have to offer? And what really energizes me? And to me, the combination of what you have to offer that energizes you, that also serves the world, is sort of, how can I be purposeful in this moment? And so I thought about, for me, what was really important was bringing this book and podcast so that leaders can learn more. And that's where I came up with 1 million people that I want to impact so that they know. I mean, one of the main messages of the book, by the way, and both Wired for Authenticity and Wired for Disruption, but really in particular Wired for Disruption, one of the main messages, we're actually wired, to be able to be agile in times of disruption. We have to just activate these muscles that are already within us. So with as much anxiety and perhaps uncertainty, which can create, this sense of threat in the body, there is this other network that most of us are not even aware of in the workplace. We just have to activate that within ourselves. And then, that is at the core of our impact, the little model that you all have, which is once your core is fully present, connected, and alive, your impact can really be boundless, in my view.
Right. Thank you. There are a couple of more questions coming, but for the paucity of time, in the end, if we have some more time left, we would like to really know your perspective of that. So
absolutely. Yeah, please connect with me. Please connect with me. There's a wonderful podcast episode with Atul. So please check out if somebody can link that Atul podcast episode, because he talks about human leadership. And I'm, I would love to connect with any one of you. So connect with me on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to be of service. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Henna. Thank you so much again for sharing all those inspirational things with us. So I'll pass it to Bhavna. Over to you.
Thank you, Rajesh, and thank you, Henna. What a great segue for me to start this conversation with Andreas. I think in your session, you spoke about, you led the foundation for this conversation. You spoke about shifts. You talk about sustainable planet and how Davos is talking about sustainable business, whether it's reducing carbon footprints and, CEOs getting worried about how can they make business sustainable. And you spoke about fundamental shifts. So I think Andres here is, going to continue the conversation, but focusing on sustainable leadership. How do business leaders have to change to make those sustainable or purposeful business ambitions fulfilled? So without further ado, Andres, I would like to invite you to the hot seat. If you can unmute yourself, that would be great. And let me begin by asking you to share, I'm going to shift suddenly the gears here, but let me begin by asking you, your earliest memories, what led you to choose the path you're walking today? And what is the destination which you see walking on this path? So in a nutshell, I'm asking you, what's your story, Andres?
Thanks, Bhavna. Thank you so much, Henna. There are some wonderful connections, I think, to what's brought me to my story. And I just want to express deep appreciation that we're gathering on a Sunday to talk about what it is to be the best of being human, because the world really needs it at the moment. Starting with something that I do now, I take people into nature and I help them prepare to touch on mindfulness and connecting with the body and a different kind of awareness. I help people to slow down and leave society or community and go to a wild place, and sometimes it can be a local park, to listen in a different way. And the more that I've done that over time, the more that I notice that when I go to meet people after they've been there for a while, and sometimes I'll take people there for 24 hours, sometimes it will be for a few hours, I see them again and something has switched on in their eyes, and somehow they've come more alive and somehow they've started to find perspectives that they wouldn't have day to day. It's really striking. It's such a simple process in a way. It's about slowing down and remembering that we can notice, and then letting life reveal itself. You know, if we sit with the seasons, if we sit with the nature of how trees grow, if we sit with how food grows, something reveals itself that's actually very simple, that we have come very far away from. So I'm starting in the present, sorry, Bhavna, but a lot of my work is basically about saying, wow, humanity has come so far away from the rules or the principles that sustain life. And it's such a critical, urgent moment in time to try to bring that reconnection back again. There's a wonderful writer and Buddhist teacher called Joanna Macy. She also says that this moment can be exquisite, because if we can get it right, if we can reconnect, if we can shift our systems so that they realign back and sync with our wider natural systems, what a story to tell. So in a small way, that's the story that I want to be a part of. If I rewind back to those moments that you asked about, Bhavna, I graduated in my early 20s. I joined a financial institution, actually. But very, very early on, I was very drawn to questions about how the whole connected. And I was really fascinated that somehow this large organization was not able of connecting conversations. So something happened over here, but the group of people over here were effectively working on the same thing, and they had no sense that was happening. And so going back 20 years now, really, I was starting to look at questions around organizational and learning and systems thinking, and how to connect the dots up. But I also have a very strong memory of looking back behind me at a row of a bank of desks and seeing someone who I would say was a friend, who was such a bright soul outside of work, and recognizing that she'd effectively fallen asleep, metaphorically. You know, it was as if someone had taken a dial and dimmed her down to the lowest possible level. It was as if a candle had gone out. And that's always stayed with me, really. And I suppose the question or the word that comes to me that brings both of those things together is a notion of wholeness. What is it to create whole systems? What is it to nourish whole systems? What is it to be part of the whole? But how do we take care of our whole selves? And it's strange, but probably I had a little bit of that sort of torch, even as a boy. This inquiry into what is it to be whole? What is it to connect as a whole? Yeah, well, maybe one last thing to speak to what you said, Bhavna. I'm aware we don't have so much time. Well, I think maybe I've said it. You know, the purpose and what I'm working on now is a bigger question around how, as people and how as human systems, whether it's a city or a business or a community, how do we start to bring back the principles of a healthy, whole living system? Yeah. That.
So Andres, I think, you made me curious, and what are those systems or what are those principles which you're talking about, in your vision of a new leadership model? if you talk about those, what would be those principles which will bring that wholeness in the leadership?
Well, it's maybe helpful to start by saying what are the principles that drive the dominant model of progress and the dominant way of working today. And these are principles that perhaps going back even to the age of the scientific revolution and the thinkers like Descartes and Newton, the story of what we define as human progress and being good has its roots there. And this is written down and presented in different ways at the moment. I think it feels so important that people are picking it up in different ways. I would say that the dominant story, still day to day, so much of human development is based on principles of what I would describe as maximization. So make it bigger, make it more profitable. Still, if we pick up a newspaper, the headlines are GDP, that's the measure of progress. But let's not forget that war is good for GDP. Environmental disasters are good for GDP. Is that a valid, legitimate measure of what it is to be best of human? But I would say that's still the first principle that defines how we grow. There's a principle then of competition, a strange kind of competition where perhaps we feel that winner takes all. That sort of maximized, I'm going to be the biggest, the best, as an individual or as an organization is a defining factor of success. And fundamentally, I think there's also a principle of extraction, of taking, or at least of seeing things in very linear lines. So, we extract, we produce, we manufacture. It's a bit of an aside, I'll say it because it's on the tip of my tongue, but my father was an engineer for Unilever, and he worked in Malaysia. We lived in Malaysia for a short while as a boy. And he said to me 2 years ago, Andres, I never thought, where would all the plastic go? It was just not in their awareness. It was a very, very linear, a brilliant engineer, but didn't think as a cycle, as in circles. And I think another characteristic of how we live today is this sense of detachment, of disconnection. As individuals, we've come to see the world in a very individualized way. We're detached perhaps from our whole selves internally. We're detached perhaps from each other in society. And certainly the dominant worldview is one where we've become detached from nature. So what does a new form of leadership look like? What are the principles of something else? I think it's about principles that somehow invert that dominant picture or paradigm that's brought us here. Can we start to see things in cycles, like seasons? Can we start to see webs of relationship instead? Can we start to define regenerative ways of working? And can we start to think about the pattern of the whole and how the whole stays in balance rather than trying to maximize any one part? Any healthy system or any natural system where there is a principle of maximization of a single part, that will bring the whole system crashing down. Coronavirus, if it carries on maximizing, then it brings the whole system crashing down. There's nothing in nature that constantly grows without being kept in check. So those are the principles perhaps that we might be growing to, and skipping a little bit, Bhavna, to I suppose maybe part of the same question is where I've got to with the work that we call bioleadership is to say, well, how do we adapt, or how do we shape leaders fit for growing those new paradigms, or fit for growing a world in that way? And where I've got to with it is to say there are three forms of knowledge that seem so important to transitioning in this shift. The first form of knowledge is in the intellect, and it's brilliant thinking. It includes brilliant models. And let's take, for example, circular economy, starting to see that we can engineer things in cycles and in regenerative ways, and starting to see that we can structure organizations in more collaborative, hive-like ways. that's really necessary and needed. But if we only think in that way, if we only develop ourselves in that way, then that's the same level of thinking that has brought us to this point in history. It's not enough. So the second form of knowledge that I feel is really important is about internal capacities. It's about a way of being that perhaps we've lost. And in a, there's that term, isn't there, a VUCA world, a world that is increasingly volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. It's really messy. I don't know about you, but a question on what is it to be human? I'm thinking differently than I was a week ago and a month ago and a year ago. The constant change, the constant pattern of, wow, new things are coming up. So how do we navigate that? Well, I think we need resilience, adaptability, which we've touched on, connection, love. Henna, building on what you were saying before, I'm at a point where I'd love to say, how can you not call it leadership if it doesn't incorporate love in it? Whether you're in a business or not, whatever state, there is so much at risk right now. How can we possibly act without care and love? And so how do we cultivate all of those things? I don't think it's possible by reading a textbook or going to a strategy seminar. I think we have to live it together, and we have to create experiences in which we cultivate it together. And then I'm mindful of how much I'm speaking, sorry. And then the third form of knowledge, it actually comes right back to the piece I started with around organizational learning, that somehow I don't know if we're great as people yet at connecting the dots. I don't know yet if we see the whole and we connect conversations systemically. And for me, the third form of knowledge is about shifting our capacity to learn together. Yeah, I'll stop there. Because I think there may be more questions here.
Fascinating, Andres. I think what I love the most is the language which you're using to describe leadership. I think it's very powerful. Imagine the world where leaders are using this powerful language. I think it would be transformational. And I love, the 3 principles which you talk about. And I'm also conscious of the time. I'm conscious of the questions that you're receiving in the chat, but I'm tempted to ask you this question that, in your work, you've worked with the companies like Patagonia who are really taking the lead. What are some of the examples, or, if you can share, how did they start the journey? And, people who are in this session today with us, if they were to start the journey in their organization, in their spaces, what is the starting point for us? It seems that
Yeah, it's a good one. I hope my sound is coming through okay, folks.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. I've got a little red light here. Where again with the bio leadership work, and I can send some references on this. Where we've got to is to say there are 5 kinds of story happening that demonstrate a shift in how we're reorganizing or developing ourselves in relationship to nature. I don't know if any, well, let me say them. So for example, one kind of story is that we can challenge our measures of purpose and progress in a way that's reconnected with nature. A micro example of that for me is when Paul Polman joined Unilever and said, we're not going to report on a quarterly basis. I actually think that was challenging the idea that we measure things in a short-termist linear way. But there are other, there's a large festival event producer here in the UK, and they have a thing called the Children's Fire, which means that they make sure that they base their decisions on the impact of people 7 generations ahead. So the first form of, the first story is about challenging our measures of purpose and progress. I'll try and keep this short. There's a second set of stories which are about developing new forms of organization that are more like a natural system. And implicitly by doing that, I think we care more for what's on the ground because it's not a hierarchy. There's another set of stories which are about we can work as ecosystems rather than isolated parts. There's another story which is about we can build regenerative models. And then there's another story which is about we can cultivate cultures where we actually trust that we are connected, you know. And I don't think any single organization is doing all of those things, you know, but I think there are really great examples in all of those areas. And I suppose our challenge as a generation cultivating new forms of leadership is to say, how do we accelerate those stories? And perhaps in the future, we'll find organizations that are doing 3 out of the 5 or 4 out of the 5 and so on and so on. Coming back to the question on Patagonia, I mean, I think for me, Patagonia are a great example of, well, I won't go into that. So I think calling it out is the start point. You know, calling out the fact that we are in this situation. I think, you know, if you look at some of the things that Patagonia have done and are doing, for example, with the racial justice moment that we're in, they were front-footed and said, we recognize that we have neglected this for 30 years. Now we're going to take it head on. So they're not ashamed or reserved to call out the truth. And I think when an organization does that, it's so much more energizing, you know, it's so much more energizing. So I think that's a factor. I think a wish would be, imagine that all organizations picked just 5 or 10% of their people and said, let's trust that if we support that group to go into a deep process of reconnection, to really cultivate the capacity to work with some of the things that both Henna and I have spoken about: connection, wholeness, mindfulness, care and love, good things would spiral out. And some of the stuff that I'm doing with Patagonia at the moment touch on that. You know, we're saying, let's go out into nature, let's work on let's work on new processes, but let's also work with vulnerability. Let's work with what is it to ask questions of each other. Let's work with what is it to start a revolution and resource ourselves to do that. So yeah. There's a lot to say. I hope there was something in that one, Bhavna. I think I can answer it from different places.
I think wonderful, Andres. You're giving us a good flavor, and I guess, you know, we will share your details, and if people have more questions, they can definitely connect with you. But I'll just read out, I guess, Deepak, you know, your question probably to a certain extent has been answered. If not, please let me know. I read Noha's comment, and Afshin, I invite you to ask your question, because the question or the comment seems a little bit longer. So why don't you unmute yourself and ask your question? Afshin, you're unmute yourself, please.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, wonderful.
I'm afraid that my connection is not so good, but you know, as I was listening, Andres, and I guess it's less of a question than a comment. Everything you spoke to with regards to our connection to nature and also our influence on nature and vice versa, it just emerged for me that there's a forest in Utah called the Pando Forest, which is the largest oldest single living organism in the world. I think it's about 17,000 years old. And one of the reasons that it's dying out right now is because of our inattention to the work that we are doing to nature, or the influence we're having on nature. And it speaks so much to not just how we, I suppose, care for the world, and the lovely example you gave of your father in terms of how we think about what our impact on the future could be. But it's also a great representation of the fact that this Pando Forest, while it looks like a forest and has thousands of trees, is actually one single organism, one root system, and how as human beings with nature as well, we are very interconnected and you know, part of a much bigger whole. And your examples and your conversation really sort of provoked that thinking for me again, reminding me of how important this is to leadership in changing the way we become leaders, but also in changing the way we lead our organizations. to the future. And thanks so much for sharing.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's exactly that. It's, how do we bring that mindset to the front of not just 2% or 3% of the decisions that we make, but 80% of what we're doing in our organizations,
Wonderful. Andres, you also, I know that you're a fan of wildlife and documentaries, and I think you've shared a couple of examples that how animals don't maximize, rather optimize. Would you mind sharing some of the examples which you speak about in your work, where we can learn something from the nature?
Absolutely. I mean, I can see the big example that there are some beautiful, even just 4 or 5 minute films of it at the moment, is the story of wolves in Yellowstone Park, where if you haven't seen it, again, it's just 4 or 5 minutes, and ask ourselves, if we can ask ourselves a question, how did that organize? It's fantastic. But long story short, wolves had become extinct from the park. That's not the right technical term, but there were no wolves left. And by reintroducing wolves, many aspects of the ecosystem began to grow again. So you'd think, well, it's the top predator, it eats everything, but actually it had this incredible non-linear ripple effect that brought birds back, it brought trees back, it even changed the course of the river. It's this amazing example of, wow, all of these parts are interconnected in extraordinary ways. And even the top predator doesn't take it all.
Wonderful. Thanks, Andres. And I know that we discussed, you have actually 3 questions for our audience, ask those questions to our audience, for their reactions and for their insights.
Do you know, I mean, Bhavna and I spoke about this before, just because I haven't been in your conversations, obviously, and I'm so curious. Well, one question off the bat is what resonates from what I said. And I think another one probably is the big one about where are we at in the narrative of progress? To say a little bit about that, looking at the science. And I am very grateful that there is now leadership in the world that has gone back to looking at science. But we're in a really precarious place. We're in a really precarious place. And I don't know if it is about going back to normal after the pandemic. I don't even know if it's build back better. I'm just really curious how, as a community of people who are leaders and who influence leaders in the world, how do we see the narrative that we're in now to navigate the next parts of the story? Big question, I know, but maybe something to keep speaking about.
Yeah. I'll ask actually Henna maybe to unmute herself, and if you can respond to Henna, to Andres' question. And of course, Henna has also a question, Andres, for you, and take the opportunity, Henna, to raise this question to Andres.
Sure. Thank you, Andreas, for this good work that you're doing to bring us back to our roots. I think there is a way in which in the whole industrial revolution has taken us away from our roots, and perhaps the cycle is that is wanting to be born is for us to go back to our roots. And I'm curious, because one of the things that totally fascinates me is how birds, when they're in flight, there's a lead bird, and then there are birds that are flying in pattern that optimize the system, right? It makes it easier for the system. And there is a way in which there are birds that they switch who the lead bird is. And that, I think we as humans have sort of, have these intricate mental, succession planning mechanisms, right? But somehow we've forgotten that instinctual collaboration that happens in so many species, hives and bees and ants and ant farms. And so I'm curious about what is it that as humans we can remember, perhaps, from our old time as tribes and nomads, or maybe something new we can create.
Wow, what a great thought. Should I respond, Bhavna? Yeah. Yeah, Henna, thank you. So this takes me to something which I hope is useful. There was a beautiful podcast I just listened to 2 days ago, and I can share this because it's a reference to this. Henna, you take me to the point of how do we make conscious decisions as a whole? Of course, you know, what is the pattern that holds us, and how do we connect to that pattern? And for me, we're a moment in humanity where we can choose to actively work with that pattern, or we can neglect it and stay asleep. It's so close to the heart of it. And then from that, where you took me was that we've lost actually the matriarchal form of working as humanity, where we bring all of those qualities of the mother, effectively the divine feminine energy. That's not necessarily about gender, but about working collectively from that place. So this for me was, you know, a little penny dropped for me maybe 8 years ago when I first learned that for some of the First Nations, indigenous people of the North America, society was structured around the circle of women who would, you know, the leaders may have been men, but they were brought into the circle of women to talk about different ways of well, basically actions were decided by that. And I'm answering slightly in the abstract, but there's something in that for me, both of the circle as the form. So interestingly, although the birds are in a triangle, I think there's still something about more the form of a circle. And again, the qualities that come from caring for the whole, and perhaps by watering those seeds, we start to see some of those different ways of working again. That's what comes to mind anyway when you speak.
Thanks, Andreas. And Hemant, you had you shared your perspective in the chat. Would you want to unmute yourself and share with the group?
Yeah, no, thanks, Bhavna, and thanks, Andreas and Henna. Such a nice session. I really enjoyed the inputs and great conversation. Yeah, so I do see that there is a lot of awareness and change happening. So it may be very small and incremental in a way, and the forces against working on it is big. That's why I say it's a small change. But the good news is that it is moving in the positive direction. And once this momentum picks up, we will be able to handle it. So but Andreas, all the efforts, all the awareness you are creating is amazing. I think that's what we all need to come along and kind of take this cause to the next level.
Thanks, Hemant. Thank you so much. And James, if you can unmute yourself and share what you shared in the chat.
Yes, Henna, Andreas, first off, thank you very much. I found both of your messages very, very pertinent to much of what's happening today. You know, I was struck that at the core of what you were both saying is this notion of connectedness, whether it's connected person to person or even connection to nature. And you know, the sad thing is that there seems to be a lack of awareness of the importance of this connectedness. You know, this past week, as I've watched CNN and watched my country, the U.S., tear itself because people felt a lack of connection and a lack of cohesion. You see that being played out in various ways, whether it's a disregard for the environment or even a disconnection from our own personal selves. So your talks today, you know, raised a number of questions for me about how do we reconnect. And you know, I'm reminded of the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, that we're all wrapped in the common fabric of destiny. And that destiny, if we believe that, that destiny can be extremely positive. If we don't believe it, then the destiny is very much in question. So I don't have any answers, but I appreciate the questions and the thoughts that your comments evoked in me.
Thanks, James. I'm just conscious of the time, and I just want to take an opportunity to invite actually all of you. Feel free to unmute yourself and share your comment, or if you have any question, please.
I guess I will just unmute myself. I was really touched by what James talked about, which is this sense of connection that we feel to ourselves, to each other, to the planet as a whole, to the other species. And the question I have for each of us is, what is it that helps me feel more connected? And so perhaps it's a coaching question for each of us, is to help us, each of us, discover what is it that helps me feel more connected to a beloved community, whether that's a community that I work with at work, or a community of this, virtual community, or a beloved community of the human race and the planet.
Very powerful question, Henna. And as you said, that it is a coaching question, and I guess we will think about it. And as you were asking it, a thought came to my mind, and I was thinking, the more my inner lens is clear, that helps me to connect. But I'm going to think about this question today, and hopefully will connect with you and stay in touch to continue this conversation and share the perspective. But I just want to quickly wrap, if there are no more questions, and invite Atul. I think one more time, a big thank you, Henna, for sharing, and Andreas joining us. Both of your work has a very, very powerful language. You introduce love to the leadership. How wonderful. So I think a big thank you to both of you introducing love to leadership. I think leadership without love is exactly like a body without heart. We can't bring people to work if they don't have heart. It surprises me that how health and mental well-being has become so important, as if before pandemic, mental health was not at all an important issue. So I guess before heart becomes an important issue, we should bring love as in the vocabulary of leadership. You both spoke about shifts happening and how we have to change. You both spoke about sustainability, how leadership is changing, bringing purpose to the business, and how we need to change the leadership. And I love Henna. By the way, I listened to your podcast and I love it. Transformative leadership. Andres, you spoke about optimization versus maximization. You speak about extraction versus regeneration. I think these are very, very powerful takeaways, which I'm taking with me today to think about. So a big thank you for giving this provocative thoughts, and to help us to clear the path and take something back to our organizations or wherever we work. So with that, I would like to thank all of you to be with us. And Atul, I invite you to conclude the session for us.
Awesome. Thanks, Bhavna. And what a fascinating time together this morning, afternoon, evening for everyone. And I can't thank you enough, Henna and Andres, to be with us, be with this community, share your perspective, and bring to life some of these concepts, which are pretty deep, I can tell you. I mean, being a practitioner and being in the business, these are complex shifts or transformations, but you made it so simple and easy with your examples, with your stories, that it touched a lot of us. I'm sure people are reflecting, and I can see the dialogue box. There are some ongoing conversations, and I am kind of thinking, how do we make sure that we address all these questions, Bhavna, maybe post this session, to make sure that with your help, Henna and Andres, we can help address some of these very critical points which are coming up. And I'm sure, like everyone else, there are things which just stuck with me and stayed with me during these few minutes we were together. And I think, Henna, you and Andres both spoke about kind of a wholesome leadership in using your own words, you're using your own context. And being in the business, and also being in the business of actually developing leaders and helping them to grow in the organization, I mean, I see this extraordinary focus on supercharging capabilities and skills and not really investing in that wholesome leadership which you talked about. And I can tell you today, when I see in the face of this pandemic, this situation, leaders who are struggling are those leaders who are not able to differentiate between what is needed and what people are looking for, how they want to be inspired, how they want to be led, versus doing more of what people are used to do. So people are getting tired, and I think there are times when I feel that very senior leaders who are in positions of consequence and are shaping the future of the organizations and people are struggling themselves to find that balance in terms of what would it take to create a sustained impact. So they are doing a little bit of a hit and trial. So they're doing, can I change my strategy, or can I just hype up a particular segment of my business which may have a better traction going forward because the world is changing. But reality is that these are solutions which are not going to help people to lead a more wholesome, more complete life for themselves, create impact on them, create impact on people they're leading, and create impact on the society at large. So I think it's a very powerful messages which you left with us today, but in very simple ways, in very simple words, and making it a very, very engaging conversation. And Andres, you talked about resilience. And by the way, that stuck with me because I've been, again, in my business conversations, talking about resilience in the past few days or so. This has come out as one of the key strengths which will help people to go through. I mean, pandemic is a metaphor to my mind of any adversity which you are faced with. We have had, as James said, I'm not an American, but I live in the US and I'm impacted by the events which are unfolding around us. There's been a change, and people who are able to deal with this situation are those leaders who understand resilience and are able to transform or change accordingly. And to me, one of the biggest learnings I've kind of gathered around my experiences that resilient leaders actually build resilient teams, and they build systemic resilience. So they create processes, they create systems which are resilient. So it's a little bit of a kind of a misunderstanding in the organizations when we talk about resilience in the context of a personality trait or a leadership trait. It's building a much broader, resilient world around you, your families, your friends, how they deal with that situation. So I think there were some real strong, important messages which you left with us. This is an ongoing dialogue, and I'm so glad we had Andres and Henna, you join us today in this conversation. We continue to have these dialogues on a regular basis. So I know a lot of you are probably first time in this conversation, and I hope you enjoyed. I know it's very odd time for some of you, and you made a choice on a Sunday to be part of this conversation. I feel that's a gift of time, that's a gift of contributions to all of us, and we intend to continue these conversations. And I think this is probably the strongest connection of a human connection, just being another person who's interested to learn more and to contribute to the broader well-being of the entire leadership agenda. And that's all, by the way, leadership at Humanity, or leadership and humanity is all about, which is be yourself. I mean, I see every day people struggling. Henna, you said the need to look good all times. So there is so much pressure to be right every time, to win every time, to have the pressure of look good in every situation, to learn fast and to avoid conflict, find your way to maneuver through a complex situation so you don't have to deal with a difficult conversation. And I think the time is to transition from that to being more authentic, being who you are, being real, being purpose-led, and really be open to growth. And growth comes with a little bit of ups and downs. I mean, sometimes those are tough conversations. Sometimes those are difficult phases in our lives, in our journeys, whether those are careers or relationships. You deal with those difficult situations and you come out stronger on the other end of that phase. So the time is to make that transition. And I think I also am a big believer it starts with us. Before we start telling others to do that, we got to start with ourselves and challenge and question ourselves every day. Am I doing the right thing? Am I doing it because I believe in it? Or am I doing it because this will look good or this will look nice? So I feel so connected with this conversation. I feel passionate about leadership and humanity. And I feel privileged. I have a group of people, friends like yourselves, who are interested to be part of this journey. And we continue to have these conversations. If you are interested, do let us know. We'll keep sending you invites for these sessions. And this is expanding. I mean, this community is expanding, and we'll have more leaders who will come and share their perspective. And I think in the end, if we are able to make a little bit of impact in rewriting the code of leadership, as you said, Andres, we need to probably redefine how to lead. And if we can make a beginning, even if it's small, I think it'll grow, and it will grow, and people will get attracted, and we will build something which is tangible shift in the way leadership is ever experienced in our context. So I know we are coming to the end of the conversation. Any final comments, Andres and Henna, and then we will close after that. And I hope, by the way, you enjoyed the experience as much as we enjoyed your presence. So Andres, Henna, yeah.
Henna, please.
Yeah, I'm just present to some gratitude here within myself right now for the love that is in this community. One of the things that I'm working on for myself is beloved community. For a lot of my career, I've been focused on sort of here's the kind of the next thing. But I think that what you all have created here is so very special. And I love the desire on a Sunday to come together to talk about the things that we're most passionate about and to learn. And so I'm deeply grateful to all of you. And so my heart is very full right now. Thank you.
Thanks.
I would just share a very similar glow. What a joy to connect with people all around the world, asking questions like these. And it's funny, something came to me just as Atul was speaking, that the more I've done the work with nature and taking people into nature, the more I realize a great deal of it is about belonging and feeling a shared sense of belonging together. And I'm carrying a little bit of that, and I'd love to stay connected with the group. So many thanks again, and many warm greetings from here in Bristol. Yeah, and Bhavna, Atul, and the team, thank you for making it possible, and the invitation as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Andres and Henna. Atul, with your permission, just one last thing which I wanted to ask both Andres and Henna. If our, people today in this call wants to stay in touch with you, what is the best way to keep in touch with both of you?
Just connect with me on LinkedIn.
Wonderful.
And a plug for the podcast, please subscribe, because I'm interviewing some amazing, inspiring leaders who have thought-provoking ideas. I want to invite Andres to my podcast. And so you'll be listening to Andres hopefully soon as well.
And Henna has also launched a new book, Wired for Disruption, which is great in addition to Wired for Authenticity. So I think that's another opportunity for you to get to know Henna much better. Andres, what's the best way to connect with you?
Henna, I'm looking forward to that already. Thank you. Thank you. LinkedIn's good as well, folks, and we're going to try and set up a few groups working on similar questions. So maybe there's a few things that can spiral from there. And I hope it's okay. I popped in the chat that we've just launched a global fellowship, a bioleadership fellowship, where we want to connect people who are really working on challenges and projects related to some of what we've spoken about. So do have a look, and if it resonates, or if you think of people in the world that you think could be part of that community, I'd really appreciate any suggestions. I really would love that to be diverse and supportive globally. But yeah, I would love to stay connected. LinkedIn is great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, a final thanks, Bhavna, to you and Rajesh for doing all the groundwork to make this such a engaging session for everybody. And by the way, to the broader community, any suggestions or ideas or anything you would like to see more of, or anything you feel we should do differently, just pop a message to me or anyone, Bhavna, Rajesh, and we'll make sure that we continue to have these energizing conversations and do our bit to make this world a little better place. So I appreciate your time. Have a wonderful rest of the Sunday. And be in touch.
Before everyone goes, we need to take a picture. So just hold on.
Yes, thanks.
If you just switch on your cameras, a picture for the memory.
Just bear with us because we have two frames. So just give me 1 second. Hang on. And that's it. Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone. It's amazing.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, guys. Great seeing you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Rajesh, Bhavna, maybe you can stay for a minute.
Yeah, sure. I think they've not realized that they're still in the call.
Bhavna, you want to stop recording?
Give me 1 second. I'm just actually manually removing.
Response.